The wind had a lonely sound in Hollow Creek. It swept through empty storefronts, rattled loose shutters, and carried dust across the abandoned boardwalk like whispers of everything the town used to be. Once, men had crowded these streets with pockets full of mining wages and dreams of striking silver. Now the mines were closed, the company bankrupt, and most families had packed what little they owned and headed east. All but one. At the far end of Main Street stood a two-story inn with peeling white paint and a stubborn glow in its front window. Every night, without fail, Cristina lit the same brass lantern and hung it by the door. The Last Chance Inn was nearly empty. 2 rooms rented long-term. 2 widowers, too old to move on. But Cristina kept it running as though a full house might arrive any minute. She scrubbed the floors. She aired out the linens. She brewed coffee at dawn, and every evening she lit the lantern. Foolish pride. Old Mr. Handley had muttered more than once from his rocker near the hearth. "Town's dead, Miss Cristina. Best let it rest." Cristina would only smile. A town isn't dead so long as someone believes in it. But belief didn't pay the bills. She stood behind the front desk that evening. Ledger open before her. The numbers were thinner than she liked to admit. The bank in Carson had sent 2 letters already. If she couldn't meet the next payment, the inn would be claimed, just like the mercantile and the livery stable. Cristina closed the ledger gently. The inn had belonged to her parents. She had been born in the upstairs room, overlooking the creek. She had learned to walk along these boards, learned to cook in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and smoke. Leaving wasn't just business, it was surrender. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the hills in copper light. Cristina stepped onto the boardwalk, lantern in hand. She struck a match and shielded the flame from the wind. For a moment it flickered wildly, as if unsure whether it wished to live. "Come on now," she murmured softly. The wick caught a steady golden glow, bloomed against the coming dark. She hung the lantern on its hook beside the door. From the edge of town came a distant sound, metal against metal, a rhythmic clatter. Cristina stilled. The railroad line ran half a mile beyond Hollow Creek, laid down during the mining boom. Lately, only the occasional freight passed through, never stopping. But this sound was different. Slower, closer. Curiosity tugged at her feet before caution could argue. She stepped off the boardwalk and walked toward the sound, boots crunching over gravel. As she reached the rise overlooking the tracks, she saw it. A small rail car, hand-powered, slowing to a halt beside the old loading platform. A man climbed down. He was tall, coat dusted from travel, hat brim low over sharp eyes that scanned the silent town. He carried a leather satchel and moved with the purpose of someone who measured things for a living. Cristina hesitated behind a stack of abandoned crates. The man glanced toward Main Street and paused. Even at a distance, she saw his gaze catch on the faint glow of her lantern. It was the only light in the whole of Hollow Creek. He removed his hat, as though acknowledging it. Cristina felt her pulse quicken. Strangers rarely stopped anymore. And men connected to the railroad often meant assessments, closures, decisions made far from here that sealed a town's fate. Still, something in the way he studied that lantern didn't seem dismissive. It seemed curious. She straightened her shoulders and stepped forward into the open. "If you're looking for a place to stay," she called, voice steady despite her racing heart, "the inn is still open." The man turned fully toward her now. Even across the distance, she sensed the weight of his attention. He gave a small nod. "Well," he replied, his voice carrying across the quiet tracks. "That's good to hear." Cristina didn't yet know his name, but as the last light of day faded and her lantern burned brighter against the dark, she had the strange feeling that Hollow Creek's story wasn't finished after all. Cristina waited at the edge of the tracks as the stranger secured his small rail car. Up close, she could see he wasn't a drifter or a fortune seeker. His boots were polished despite the dust. His coat, though worn from travel, was well tailored. A silver watch chain glinted against his vest. He approached with measured steps. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Mike." "Cristina," she replied. I run the Last Chance Inn. His eyes flicked toward Main Street again, to the lonely lantern glowing in the distance. Seems you run the only thing still running in this town. A faint smile curved her lips. Someone has to. They walked back together, the silence of Hollow Creek settling around them like a heavy blanket. No piano drifted from the saloon anymore. No laughter spilled from the boarding houses. Only the wind and the soft creak of abandoned signs, swinging on rusted hinges. Inside the inn, warmth wrapped around them. The hearth crackled low, and the scent of fresh bread lingered from supper. Cristina gestured toward a chair near the fire. "Traveling through?" she asked. "Something like that," Mike said, as he set his leather satchel on the table. "Railroad sent me to inspect the western spur lines. There's talk of cutting routes that aren't profitable." Cristina's hand stilled on the back of a chair. "Cutting," she repeated quietly. He nodded. "Tracks cost money to maintain. If there's no industry to support them." The unfinished sentence hung heavy in the air. Cristina moved to pour coffee, steadying herself with the simple task. "The mines went under 6 months ago. Investors pulled out, but that doesn't mean the town can't recover." Mike studied her over the rim of his cup. She met his gaze without flinching. "Farming cattle timber from the northern ridge. Hollow Creek has more than silver in its soil." He leaned back, considering her words. "You've thought this through." "I've had time," she replied softly. Mr. Hanley shuffled in from the hallway, eyeing Mike with suspicion. "Another man measuring our grave," he muttered. Cristina shot him a look. "Mr. Hanley." Mike stood politely. "Sir, I'm only here to assess the line. Nothing's decided yet." The old man huffed, but sank into his rocker. Later, after Mike had eaten and Cristina had shown him to the best room upstairs, she lingered at the bottom of the staircase. "Mr. Mike called gently." He turned from the landing. "If the railroad pulls out," she asked, "how long would we have?" His expression shifted. Less official, more human. "Not long." She nodded, as though she'd expected that answer. When he disappeared into his room, Cristina returned to the front door. She opened it and stepped outside. The lantern still burned, steadily, across the darkened town. Windows reflected nothing. No other lights answered hers. Behind her, the floorboards creaked. "You're fighting a tide, you know," Mike said quietly from the doorway. Cristina didn't turn around. "My father used to say, a single lantern can guide a traveler miles through darkness." Mike stepped beside her, following her gaze over the empty street. "And if no traveler comes, then, at least the light proves someone cared enough to keep it burning." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind shifted, softer now. "You really believe this town can come back?" he asked. She looked at him, then eyes bright in the lantern's glow. "I have too." Mike glanced from her to the silent buildings, to the tracks beyond. "I'll be here a few days," he said finally. "I need to walk the line, check the bridge supports, review freight logs." Cristina nodded. "Then, I suppose you'll need breakfast at dawn." A hint of a smile touched his mouth. "I suppose I will." As he stepped back inside, Cristina remained on the boardwalk. For the first time since the bankruptcy notices arrived, she didn't feel entirely alone in her fight. But she also knew this man carried more than a satchel and a ledger. He carried the future of Hollow Creek. And if she wanted the lantern to keep burning, she would have to convince him the town was worth saving. Dawn came pale and cold over Hollow Creek, painting the empty buildings in shades of gray. Cristina was already awake. She moved quietly through the kitchen, tying her apron and setting biscuits in the oven. The familiar rhythm of kneading dough and stirring coffee steadied her thoughts. Today, Mike would walk the line north, toward the timber ridge, and inspect the bridge crossing over Hollow Creek. What he wrote in that ledger of his could determine whether the rails stayed or were torn up, like the rest of the town's fading hopes. By the time Mike descended the stairs, hat in hand, the dining table was set. "You're up early," he remarked. "So are you," Cristina replied, sliding a plate toward him. He smiled faintly. Inspector's habit. They ate in companionable silence at first, but Cristina's mind churned with everything she wanted to say. She needed him to see more than rusted tracks and empty freight platforms. "Mind if I walk with you?" she asked at last. Mike paused mid-sip. "It's rough ground. I've walked it since I was 10. A moment passed before he nodded. "All right." They set out together, leaving the lantern extinguished in the morning light. As they reached the edge of town, Cristina felt the weight of hollow windows watching them go. The tracks stretched ahead, thin ribbons of steel cutting through sagebrush and rock. Mike knelt every so often, examining bolts and wooden ties, making notes in his ledger. Cristina watched him work, precise, methodical, distant. "You always this serious?" she asked lightly. He glanced up. "Serious keeps bridges from collapsing." She crouched beside him. "And what keeps towns from collapsing?" He didn't answer immediately. They continued toward the creek. The wooden trestle bridge loomed ahead, sturdy but weathered. Below, water trickled over smooth stones, quieter than it had been during the mining boom. Mike tested beams, checked supports, scribbled figures. "It's sound," he admitted. "Better than I expected." Cristina's heart lifted slightly. "My father helped build it. Said it had to outlast him." Mike looked at her then, not as an inspector, but as a man hearing a story. "You planning to outlast it too?" he asked. "If I have to." They crossed the bridge and climbed toward the northern ridge. Pine trees thickened there, tall and strong. "Timber," Cristina said, gesturing. "Plenty of it. The mines might be closed, but lumber's always needed." Mike studied the slope thoughtfully. "You'd need investors." "I need time," she replied. "Time the railroad can give us." He closed his ledger for the first time since they'd left town. "You know what the board sees when they look at Hollow Creek," he said quietly. "Losses, empty freight logs, maintenance costs." "And what do you see?" she pressed. He hesitated. "I see one lantern burning in a dead town," he said finally. Cristina swallowed. "It's not dead." Mike met her gaze. "It's close." The honesty stung, but she respected it. They stood in silence as wind stirred the trees above them. "I've shut down towns before," he continued, voice lower now. "Watched families pack up, watched storefronts go dark. It's not something I enjoy." "Then don't do it here," Cristina whispered. The vulnerability in her voice surprised even her. Mike looked away toward the valley below. From this height, Hollow Creek looked small, but not invisible. The inn stood out faintly against the dust. He reopened his ledger, slowly. "There's an old freight contract listed," he said. "Timber shipments from 15 years back. If production resumed, even modestly." Cristina's pulse quickened. "Then the line has purpose." "Possibly," he admitted, flirted, but she forced herself to stay steady. As they began walking back toward town, Mike spoke again. "You'd be taking a risk, rallying people, convincing them to come back." "I'm not afraid of risk," she replied. "I'm afraid of regret." He studied her profile, the determined line of her jaw, the stubborn light in her eyes. By the time they reached Main Street, the sun was high, and the dust shimmered in the heat. Cristina stopped outside the inn. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing more than numbers." Mike slipped the ledger into his satchel. "I haven't written my report yet," he reminded her. But as he glanced once more at the hook where the lantern would hang that evening, something in his expression had changed, and Cristina dared to believe the light might be reaching him after all. By the fourth night of Mike's stay, word had begun to spread quietly, stubbornly, that a railroad inspector was in Hollow Creek. Two former miners rode back through town that afternoon, drawn by curiosity and perhaps by something else. The sight of smoke rising from the inn's chimney. Cristina had fed them both stew and talk of timber contracts. She spoke of opportunity like it was already breathing. Mike watched it all from the corner table. "You're recruiting," he said later. Once the men had left. "I'm reminding people this place still exists," Cristina corrected. He leaned back in his chair. "Optimism isn't infrastructure." "No," she agreed. "But it builds the will to create it." That evening, the wind shifted. Clouds rolled over the hills, heavy and fast-moving. By sundown, the air felt tight with electricity. Cristina stepped outside to light the lantern, as she had every night. The match flared bright, but the wind nearly stole it from her fingers. "Not tonight," she muttered. She cupped the flame, coaxed the wick to life, and hung the lantern just as thunder cracked across the valley. Rain followed sudden and hard. Mike joined her under the narrow awning. "That bridge we crossed," he said over the roar of the storm. "If the creek rises too fast..." Cristina didn't wait for him to finish. They grabbed coats and hurried toward the tracks, rain soaking them within seconds. The creek was already swelling, muddy water pushing hard against the trestle supports. Mike moved with urgency now, no longer just an observer. He waded along the bank, checking the lower beams, while Cristina held the lantern high, its light wavering against sheets of rain. "Water's hitting debris upstream," she shouted. "If it jams, I see it." A thick branch had lodged against one of the supports, forcing the current to split violently around it. Without hesitation, Mike stepped deeper into the rushing water, boots slipping against slick stones. "Mike," Cristina cried. He braced himself and pushed against the branch. It wouldn't budge. Cristina scanned the bank and spotted a long iron rod left over from mining days. She splashed toward him, nearly losing her footing. "Use this." Together, they wedged the rod beneath the branch and heaved. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the wood snapped free, swept instantly downstream. The pressure against the bridge eased. Mike staggered back to shore, drenched and breathing hard. Cristina grabbed his arm to steady him. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain poured around them, but the bridge held firm. "You could have been swept away," she said, voice trembling despite her attempt at calm. "So could the line," he replied. Lightning flashed, illuminating the trestle in stark white. They stood there longer than necessary, hands still clasped. Back at the inn, soaked clothes hung near the fire. Cristina poured whiskey into 2 cups. "2 stubborn bridges," she said, raising hers. Mike smiled faintly. "And stubborn ink." They sat close to the hearth, thunder rumbling softer now. "I've inspected dozens of lines," Mike said quietly. "Most towns crumble long before nature tests them. They give up." Cristina stared into the flames. "Hollow Creek's been tested before." He looked at her. "And you?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "I've been alone since my parents passed. I thought keeping the inn running was enough. But tonight, I realized I don't just want survival." "What do you want?" She met his gaze. "I want a future." Silence stretched between them, not empty, but full. The storm eased to a steady patter against the roof. "You know," Mike said carefully, "if I recommend a probationary extension on the line 6-month sit, would give time to secure timber contracts." Cristina's breath caught. "You'd do that?" "I'd be betting my reputation on it." She reached for his hand again, more deliberately this time. "You won't regret it." Their eyes held closer now than either had intended when he first stepped off that rail car. Outside, the lantern still burned, its glow steady against the fading storm. For the first time in months, Hollow Creek didn't feel abandoned. It felt like it was waiting, and perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't waiting alone anymore. Morning broke clean and bright after the storm. Hollow Creek looked different in the sunlight, not bustling, not restored but washed fresh, as though the rain had cleared more than dust from its streets. The creek ran strong but steady beneath the trestle. The bridge stood firm. Cristina stepped onto the boardwalk with a quiet sense of resolve. She had slept little, her mind turning over Mike's words again and again. A probationary extension. 6 months. It wasn't salvation, but it was a chance. Inside the inn, Mike sat at the dining table, his ledger open, pen moving with careful strokes. Cristina paused in the doorway, watching him. This wasn't just ink on paper. It was risk, reputation, belief. He glanced up, sensing her gaze. "I'm nearly finished," he said. Her hands tightened around the coffee pot she carried, and Mike set the pen down slowly. "I'm recommending the railroad maintain service to Hollow Creek for 6 months, under review. The line is structurally sound. The bridge passed a flood test last night." A faint smile touched his lips. And there's potential for renewed freight through timber contracts. Cristina exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. 6 months, she repeated softly. 6 months to prove the town still has a pulse. She crossed the room and set the coffee aside, emotion rising fast in her chest. Thank you, Mike. He stood, but his expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. This isn't charity, he said. It's a gamble. I know. He hesitated. The board won't be pleased if it fails. Cristina lifted her chin. Then we won't let it fail. Later that afternoon, she rang the old brass bell outside the inn, the one that hadn't been rung since the mining days. Its sharp clang echoed across the quiet street. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared. Cristina stood tall on the boardwalk. The railroad is giving Hollow Creek 6 months, she announced. 6 months to bring work back. Timber, trade, livestock shipments. But it'll take all of us. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Old Mr. Hanley stepped forward first. 6 months is more than we had yesterday. One by one, others nodded. Plans began forming right there in the dusty street. A team would clear the logging trail. Another would repair the abandoned sawmill north of town. Letters would be sent to ranchers in neighboring counties. Hope, once faint as a dying ember, began to catch. Mike watched from near the tracks, hat low over his eyes. Cristina crossed to him once the crowd dispersed. You did more than save a rail line, she said quietly. He shook his head. You did that the moment you kept that lantern burning. A train whistle sounded faintly in the distance of freight passing through on the main line. Soon, if all went well, it would stop here again. You'll be leaving, Cristina said, the words heavier than she intended. Tomorrow, he confirmed. Silence stretched between them. And after 6 months, she asked carefully. Mike studied her, the determined innkeeper who had stood alone against bankruptcy and storm. If Hollow Creek proves itself, he said, I may have reason to return. Inspect progress. Cristina smiled softly. Strictly business, of course, he agreed, though something warmer flickered in his gaze. That evening, as sunset painted the sky gold and rose, Cristina stepped onto the boardwalk once more. She struck a match. The lantern flared to life, brighter than ever against the coming dusk. But this time, it wasn't the only light. Across the street, a window glowed where someone had lit a lamp. Farther down, another flickered on. Hollow Creek was still fragile, still uncertain, but no longer dark. Mike stood beside her as they watched the growing lights. You were right, he said quietly. One lantern can guide a traveler. Cristina slipped her hand into his, and sometimes, she replied, it convinces him to stay. The wind moved gently through the town, not lonely now, but alive with possibility. And in Hollow Creek, the last lantern no longer burned alone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Western stories.